reading John chapter 13, 31 through 35. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." This is the word of the Lord.
Is there an invitation song?
Yeah, the invitation song will be number 922.
922. Thank you for that reading, Paul. Hello everyone. I'm glad you all are here, and if you're a visitor, I hope that you feel welcomed here. Before we get off, I'd like to say that I'm thankful for this opportunity to speak, and it's an honor, and I'd like to thank you very dearly. And I hope that as I give you this lesson, I hope that you are edified by God's word as much as I was preparing this lesson. Tonight we'll be talking about Jesus the servant, and the passages that we will be going over are Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 27, John chapter 13, verses 1 through 16, and John 13, verses 31 through 35. Before we start, I'd just like to go over the goals so I can help stay on track and so you guys can follow with me. And the first goal that I'd like to point out to you, that what I'm going to try to teach to you, is how to be great, and that passage will come from Luke 22. The second goal is who is the greatest, and I'll come from John 13. And the third goal is why he is the greatest, from John 13 also. So we'll start off with Luke chapter 22. Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And before we continue, I'd just like to kind of dive into why there was dispute, because I thought that this was kind of interesting. So as we start at the beginning of the chapter, we see that verses 1 through 6, that the scribes sought to kill Jesus, and during that time, Satan entered Judas' heart and went to the scribes and talked about betrayal of Jesus. Verses 17 through 13 is whenever Jesus sent the disciples, who I believe are Peter and John, are sent to look for a man carrying a bucket of water, and that man would have a room for them to have the Passover in. And then in Luke chapter 22, verses 14 through 23, that's Jesus then instituting the Lord's Supper and tells them that one would betray him. Now this is where it kind of gets, I thought it was kind of weird, because in verse 23, it goes on about how the disciples acquired among each other on who would betray Jesus. And then in verse 24, it goes to a dispute of them arguing over who is the greatest. I thought that didn't really add up. But as I thought about it, as they acquired, that's them searching out who would betray Jesus. So they're pointing fingers at each other, and they're saying, "Oh, you might be the one." And then the guy that they're pointing at, they're like, "How can you point at me whenever I'm obviously better than you? You know, you can't point your fingers at me because I just heard you cuss later." And it could be something like that, and then that would lead them to this whole entire different argument over who's the greatest. And then I'd assume that the least greatest would be the one pointed with the blame of betraying Jesus. So as we continue on in Luke chapter 22, now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And he said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves." So in this first verse, he's basically pointing out that the Gentiles have this way of thinking that who's the greatest. And they think that the people that are kings and exercise lordship are benefactors. And benefactors is a word that is used, the definition is the ones of high ranking or of greatness. So the Gentiles think that the people of greatness have power and authority over everyone that they know. And we see that this is backed up in Daniel chapter 3, verses 4 through 7. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall and worship the gold image that the king Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a fiery furnace." So what we can see here, it's Nebuchadnezzar commanding everyone to worship this golden idol that he has created. And with him being the king and the great one, he's exercising his lordship over them, and he's commanding them, and he's backing up that commandment with a death penalty of being put in a fiery furnace. And then in the next verse of Luke 22, verse 26, Jesus then says, so that's not how we should think at all. Instead, he who is greatest among you, let him be the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. So we could see that there was this worldly view of all of them thinking that, all the people that are great are the ones that have power and all the authority, and they get to do whatever they want. But Jesus says that you guys should be put apart from this world's ideas, and you guys should instead think that the greatest among you is the younger, or a person who is meek and submissive, and he who governs acts as a person who serves. And we see this also backed up in 1 Peter 5, verses 2 through 3. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And I have the part underlined that says, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, and that's basically what Jesus is saying, plus those other things. But he's telling them not to abuse their power, but to instead serve the people that they are over and being examples. And with these two different ideas, I thought it would be good to have them in a table and to compare them and contrast them with each other just to see how much differently they are. So greatness with Christians in Luke 22, verse 26, it's he who is greatest should be like the younger, meek and submissive, while in Daniel 3 with the Gentiles, the king forced his power on the people with a death penalty and his commandments of worshiping the idol. And then also in Luke 22, verse 26, the leaders or governors should be the ones who serves. But in Daniel chapter 3, it's the king of the cities and the people who have power who have people serve them, and they serve them by worshiping his idols. And then in Luke chapter 22, verse 27, he hits them with this question to kind of wrap up the whole thing. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. And so he asked them this question, and whenever I read the beginning of this verse, for who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves, I was for a split second, it's the guy who sits at the table. And that just kind of shows on how much of this idea is spread throughout our area, because especially in school, the people of greatness are the most popular, most athletic, the smartest, and whatnot. But Jesus kind of shows that people think that because he says, is it not he who sits at the table? But then he says it's not that because he's the one who serves. And later on we'll see that he's the greatest. And from this passage that we pulled, I just hope that you guys put together that we should know that Jesus calls us not to be the king, not to be like the kings of the Gentiles and rule unrightfully, exercising lordship over the people we have, like Nebuchadnezzar did. But instead, he calls us to be like a younger child, being meek and submissive, and not to exercise our lordship, but instead to serve. And as we go on to our next passage, I'd like you to keep these ideas in your mind as we read this passage. So John chapter 13, verses 1 through 16. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And now supper being ended, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he would come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel which he was girded. And then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said to him, You shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I do not wash your feet, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you. For you knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, You are not all clean. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down, he said to them, Do you know what I have done to you? You call me Lord and teacher, and you say, Well, for I am so. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. So to begin this lengthy reading, John 13, verses 1 through 3, that is basically a summary of what Jesus has thought through as what Jesus is thinking at this time. And as we see, he's thinking that he's thinking about his death at the time, and that Judas has Satan in his heart and will betray him, and that he had come from God and was going to God, meaning that he'd leave this world. And all those things were on his mind. And even with all those things on his mind, we see that in John 13, verses 4 through 5, he rose from supper and laid aside his garments and washed his disciples' feet. And I thought that was pretty selfless of him, because as I was preparing this lesson, which is not by any means so important as him dying on the cross, I couldn't think about other people. I was just thinking about how I'd get this lesson done and how I'd get through it. So I thought that was incredibly selfless by him. And then on John 13, verses 6 through 11, it's this conversation in between him and Peter. And once Jesus goes around and reaches Peter, Peter asks if Jesus is going to wash his feet. And Jesus replies to him, What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. And this verse I think is very important, because there's some churches in this world that see this passage, and what they take from it is, we should wash each other's feet during communion. And that's not what this passage is getting at. And we know that here in this verse, because he states, What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. So this is kind of hinting that this is way bigger than just washing of feet, and it has a much bigger meaning. And then verse 8, Peter says to Jesus, You shall never wash my feet. And the reason Peter has this response is because at the time, all they had were open-toed sandals, and all their roads were dirt and sand, and probably had horse manure or camel manure or whatever. So their feet were really dirty. And the washing of the feet would be the job of the lowest servant. And so with Jesus washing the disciples' feet, that's way out of place. Like, he probably shouldn't be doing that, but he's doing it anyway because he's Jesus. But that's not out of place. And Peter saw that. And Jesus said to him, If I do not wash your feet, you have no part with me. And so this kind of what this is saying is, if he doesn't wash Peter's feet, and if Peter doesn't accept that service, then he would have no part with Jesus. And that's kind of like his crucifixion, because if we don't accept his death and we don't accept his service, then we won't have any part with him in that meeting either. And then Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And I thought that this response very much suited Peter because he wanted everything to do with Jesus. He didn't want to betray Jesus in the slightest. And so once he found out that if he doesn't do this, then he won't take part of Jesus, he wants to do it tenfold. He wants his feet, he wants his feet washed and also his hands and his head because he wants to be that much apart with Jesus. And Jesus responds to that by saying, "He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you." And this all of you is just speaking to Judas, as in he's not clean because he has Satan in his heart. And then John chapter 13, verses 12 through 16. Here we could see that what Jesus is doing is much more than just a mere washing of the feet. In verse 15, we could see that Jesus says that he's giving them an example. And this example is an example of servanthood, that we should do the same as him. And I would also like to point out in this verse, in verse 14, that Jesus knew that he was the Lord and he was teacher, and that the people call him that, and they are right to call him that. And then he still goes out and he still washes their feet and he still serves them as the lowest servant of all. And as I was reading this passage, going back to the churches that wash feet during or after communion, I thought that they might take heed of verse 14, because it says, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." And I thought that they might use that verse to support their doings, because he's saying, "Oh, I washed your feet, so you guys got to wash one another's feet." But I think of that verse as a metaphor describing the feet washing as a service, because in verse 16 it says, "Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who sent greater than he who sent him." And both of those verses have the same meaning. Verse 14 is saying that, "Oh, I'm your Lord and I'm your master, so if I do something, you guys also have to do it." And verse 16 is saying basically the same thing, because a servant is not greater than his master. So if his master does something, then we have to do it also. And that is talking the way of serving, because Jesus served, we also have to serve in that same way. And recalling back to the criteria that we learned in Luke 22 on how to be great, we should apply it to this passage also, just to see who is the greatest. So in Luke chapter 22, verse 26, we see that the person who is great should be like the younger, being meek and submissive. And in John 13, verse 4, we see that Jesus girds himself with garments and washes his disciples' feet, which was a job for the lowest and youngest servant. So we see that he follows that criteria. And then the second criteria of the leaders or the governors being the ones who serve, we see that in John 13, verse 14, is that he is their Lord and master. He says that he's their Lord and master, and he still washes their feet, because he's the master. He would serve them in that way. And this isn't one of the only ways that Jesus has served people. He's served people by feeding the 5,000 in Matthew chapter 14. He's served people by healing of the 7 lepers and any sickness in Luke chapter 17. Washing of the feet, as we just covered in John 13. And most importantly, dying on the cross in Matthew 27. But there are many, many other ways he has served everyone, because his whole entire life is a service to us. By him humbling himself to be put in this world, that his whole entire life was a service to us. And with all this serving, that's just, we can tell that he's the greatest just by following the criteria and just by how much he serves. But I think that there is another reason why he is the greatest, and we will see that in John 13, verses 31 through 35. "So when he had gone out, Jesus said, 'Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and glorify him immediately. Little children, I shall be with you a little longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come. Now I say to you, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.'" And so in John 13, verses 31 through 32, what he's basically saying is if we glorify God, then God will glorify us in himself. And the reason that he's stating this is because later in the passage we see that he gives a commandment. And if we follow his commandments, we glorify God, and then he will in return glorify us in himself. And then in John chapter 13, verse 33, he states, "Little children, I shall be with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come. So now I say to you." And I just think that this is him just emphasizing on what he's about to say, because he's claiming that he's going away, and he's going away within 15 to 12 hours. So it's very close to him and his trial and his death. And so he's calling urgency to what he's about to say. And what he's about to say is he's about to give them a new commandment. That commandment is that we should love one another as he has loved us. That if we do this, everyone will know that we are his disciples because we have love for one another. And wrapping it all up, I'd just like to point out that he's loved us throughout the whole entire thing. And in verse 1, it states at the end, he loved them to the end. He loved them during the washing of the feet, during of the trial, during of him carrying the cross up the mountain to him on the cross. He loved us all throughout that, and even before that, he loved us through it all. And then in John 13, verse 14, he's saying that we should have this love for one another. But honestly, it's kind of impossible to have that love for one another. Like we can act like we love one another, and it's easy to do. It's not easy to act. It's easy to love one another if you're a part of the family in Christ. But the people who are not a part of the family in Christ, sometimes it's hard to love them with your heart. And it's pretty much impossible to do that. But Jesus does that constantly and continually throughout his whole entire life. And I just feel like that's another reason why it shows Jesus as the greatest throughout us all. That's my lesson, and I hope that you've been edified by it. We never want to leave a service without an invitation. So if you are having troubles loving one another, or if you want to take a step in your life of Christ and being baptized, or if you just have any problems that you need to get off your chest, please do so as we come and sing the song of invitation.